The crack of the gavel silenced the raucous crowd as Charlotte Bennett stood trembling on the auction block, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her delicate skin. It was 1873 in the dusty town of Redemption Creek, Colorado Territory, and at 22 years old, Charlotte had never imagined she would be sold like cattle to the highest bidder. Her father's gambling debts had sealed her fate, and now she was nothing more than property to be traded away. Next up, a fine young woman fit for household work. The auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the town square where men in dusty hats and women in plain dresses had gathered for the monthly auction. Strong back, clean appearance, and educated enough to read. Starting bid at $20. Charlotte kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to look at the faces of those who might become her master. Her honey blonde hair had fallen loose from its pins, partially obscuring her face, but she could feel the weight of strangers' stares assessing her worth. $20, a gravelly voice called out. 25, countered another. The bidding continued, each amount driving Charlotte deeper into despair. She had grown up as the daughter of a shopkeeper in Boston before her father's addiction had cost them everything. After his death, the creditors had come for her, claiming her as payment for his debts. $45 from Mr. Jenkins, the auctioneer announced with glee. Charlotte's eyes darted to the bidder, a heavy-set man with yellowed teeth and cruel eyes. The innkeeper's reputation for mistreating his servants was well known, and her heart plummeted at the thought of working for such a man. Going once, going twice, $100, a deep voice interrupted, causing a ripple of surprise through the crowd. Charlotte's gaze swept to the back of the gathering where a tall figure stood. The crowd parted as he stepped forward, revealing a broad-shouldered man in a worn leather duster. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the strong line of his jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. The auctioneer's eyes widened at the bid. $100 from Mr. Colton Wade. Do I hear any other bids? The crowd murmured in surprise. No one challenged the amount. Charlotte's stomach twisted with uncertainty. What kind of man would pay such a sum for a servant? Sold. The gavel came down with finality. To Mr. Colton Wade for $100. As she was led down from the platform, Charlotte kept her head high despite her circumstances. The mysterious bidder approached, and she finally got a clear look at him. Colton Wade was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with intense blue eyes that assessed her thoughtfully. Unlike many men in the crowd, his gaze didn't linger inappropriately on her body but instead met her eyes directly. "Miss Bennett," he said, tipping his hat slightly as the auctioneer handed him her papers. "I'm Colton Wade." "Sir," she responded stiffly, uncertain of the proper way to address her new owner. He gestured for her to follow him away from the crowd, leading her toward a wagon where a bay horse stood patiently in the harness. Once they were out of earshot of others, he stopped and turned to face her. "I own a cattle ranch about 10 miles outside of town," he explained, his voice steady and calm. "I need someone to help with the house." Charlotte nodded numbly, trying to prepare herself for whatever harsh labor awaited her. At least a ranch might be better than Jenkins' Inn. "The thing is," Colton continued, seeming uncomfortable for the first time, "folks around here talk. A single man with a young woman living on his property, it ain't proper." He cleared his throat. "So I've got a proposition for you." Charlotte tensed, fearing what sort of improper proposition might follow. "You'll be my wife instead." Her head snapped up, certain she had misheard. "Pardon me, not a real wife," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Just on paper, you'll have your own room, your own space. But you'll have the protection of my name, and no one will question your presence at the ranch." His eyes held her steadily. "It's the only way I can offer you safety and dignity." Charlotte stood speechless, trying to process his words. This stranger was offering her marriage instead of servitude. It seemed too good to be true. "Why would you do this?" she finally managed to ask. A shadow passed over his face. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be at the mercy of others." He gestured to her bound wrists. "May I?" When she nodded hesitantly, he pulled a knife from his belt and carefully cut the ropes, being gentle not to touch her skin. The small kindness nearly undid her composure. "You don't have to decide right now. Colton said, putting the knife away, but we should leave town soon. You can think on the journey. Charlotte rubbed her raw wrists, weighing her options. She had none. This man was her owner now, regardless of what title he gave her, yet something in his direct gaze suggested honesty. If I agree to this arrangement, she said carefully, what would be expected of me? You'd keep house, cook meals, help with gardening. The same work you do as a housekeeper, but you'd be treated with respect. He paused. And if you ever want to leave, once you've worked off the $100, you'll be free to go. Charlotte studied him, trying to detect any deception. Finding none, she made her decision. Very well, Mr. Wade, I accept your proposition. Something that might have been relief flickered across his face. Colton, he corrected. If we're to play husband and wife, you should use my given name. Colton, she repeated, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. He helped her into the wagon and climbed up beside her, taking the reins. As they pulled away from town, Charlotte felt the weight of stares following them. She knew the gossip would be immediate. Colton Wade had purchased a woman at auction and was taking her home. Yet somehow, seated beside this quiet, serious man, she felt safer than she had in months. The landscape opened up before them, the vast plains stretching toward distant mountains. Charlotte had never seen such open space, having lived her whole life in crowded Boston streets. It's beautiful, she said softly, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Colton glanced at her. The territory grows on you, harsh but honest. As the wagon rolled along the rutted trail, Charlotte studied her new husband from the corner of her eye. His profile was strong, his posture straight despite the constant jolting of the wagon. His hands, holding the reins, were calloused and strong working hands. Yet there was a gentleness in how he handled the horses, speaking to them in low, soothing tones when they encountered a difficult stretch of road. How long have you lived out here? She asked, wanting to know more about the man whose name she would soon bear. 8 years, he replied. Came west after the war, wanted open space and quiet. You fought in the war, he nodded, his expression tightening slightly. Union cavalry, but that's long past now. His tone discouraged further questions on that topic, so Charlotte changed direction. Tell me about your ranch. This brought a subtle change to his demeanor, a slight easing of the tension in his shoulders. 300 acres, most of it grazing land, got about 200 head of cattle. The house isn't much, just 4 rooms, but it's solid. Built it myself. And do you manage all this alone? Got 2 ranch hands who help with the cattle. Brothers Miguel and Tomas Diaz, good men. He glanced at her. They have a cabin on the property, they won't bother you. The implication was clear, she would be protected even from his own workers. Charlotte felt a small measure of relief at this consideration. There's a small town about 5 miles from the ranch, Colton continued. Silver Creek, has a general store, church, doctor. We go there for supplies once a month. As the day wore on, the sun beat down mercilessly. Charlotte's thin dress offered little protection, and she felt her skin beginning to burn. Without comment, Colton stopped the wagon, reached behind the seat, and handed her a wide-brimmed hat similar to his own. Belonged to my sister, he explained briefly. The sun out here isn't kind to fair skin. Charlotte accepted the hat gratefully, surprised by his thoughtfulness. You have family nearby, a muscle tightened in his jaw. Not anymore. Sarah died of fever 2 years ago. I'm sorry, Charlotte said softly, understanding the loss in his voice. I lost my mother when I was 16. He nodded in acknowledgement of their shared grief, and they lapsed into silence again. By late afternoon, Charlotte was exhausted from the journey and the emotional toll of the day. The wagon crested a hill and Colton pointed ahead. There it is, Wade Ranch. In the valley below, a modest house stood surrounded by several outbuildings. A corral held horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on rolling grasslands. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwood trees that provided the only significant shade in the landscape. As they approached, Charlotte could see that, while the house was indeed small, it was well maintained. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and she spotted a rocking chair and what appeared to be the beginnings of a garden off to one side. 2 men emerged from one of the outbuildings as the wagon approached. They waved at Colton, their curious gazes landing on Charlotte. The Diaz brothers, Colton explained. I should warn you, they don't know about our arrangement. To them and everyone else, you're my wife. It's safer that way. Charlotte's stomach tightened with nervousness. I understand. He stopped the wagon in front of the house and jumped down, coming around to help her. As his hands encircled her waist to lift her down, Charlotte felt a strange flutter in her chest at the contact. His touch was respectful but firm, and he set her gently on her feet before quickly stepping back. "Boss," called one of the approaching men. "Successful trip to town, Miguel, Tomas." Colton nodded to each in turn. "Yes, I'd say so." He placed a hand lightly on Charlotte's back. "This is Charlotte, my wife." Charlotte forced a smile, keenly aware of the surprised expressions on the brothers' faces. "Your wife," Miguel repeated, removing his hat. "When did this happen?" "It was sudden," Colton replied with a shrug. "Sometimes you just know." The brothers exchanged glances before breaking into grins. "Congratulations," Tomas said, stepping forward to shake Colton's hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Wade." The name startled Charlotte, though she knew it shouldn't have. "Thank you," she managed. "Charlotte's had a long journey," Colton interjected. "I should get her settled." The brothers nodded in understanding, still looking curious but respectful enough not to press for details. They returned to their work, though Charlotte noticed them glancing back several times. Colton led her into the house, and Charlotte was pleasantly surprised by the interior. Though sparsely furnished, it was clean and well-ordered. The main room served as both kitchen and living space, with a large fireplace, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, and a comfortable-looking armchair beside a small bookshelf. "Kitchen and living area here," Colton explained unnecessarily. "Bedroom through there," he pointed to a door on the right. "And this one," he opened a door on the left, "will be yours." Charlotte peered into a small but neat room containing a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table. A window looked out toward the creek and mountains beyond. "It was Sarah's room," Colton said quietly. "Haven't used it since." He trailed off. "Well, it's yours now. There are some of her clothes in the drawers. Might need altering, but they'll do until we can get you your own things." The consideration in this gesture touched Charlotte unexpectedly. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "This is more than I hoped for." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at her gratitude. "There's a washroom out back. I'll fetch you some water so you can clean up. You must be tired." As he left to get the water, Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overcome with the events of the day. That morning she had stood on an auction block, certain her life was over. Now she was in a clean room, treated with unexpected kindness by a man who was, by law, her owner but had chosen to call her his wife instead. She didn't trust this situation, couldn't afford to, but for the first time in months, she allowed herself a small moment of hope. When Colton returned with a bucket of water and a folded cloth, he set them on the small table. "I'll prepare something to eat while you rest," he said, already turning to leave. "Colton," Charlotte called, stopping him at the door. When he looked back, she met his gaze directly. "Why did you really buy me today?" His expression remained unreadable for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Get some rest, Charlotte. We can talk more at supper." As he closed the door, Charlotte was left with her question unanswered and a growing curiosity about the quiet, serious man who had unexpectedly become her husband. The cool water was a blessing on Charlotte's dusty skin. She washed as thoroughly as possible given the circumstances, then explored the clothes in the drawers. Sarah Wade had been taller than Charlotte, but not by much. A simple blue dress seemed the most suitable option, and though loose around the waist, it fit well enough. When she emerged from the bedroom, the smell of cooking meat greeted her. Colton stood at the stove, his back to her. "Can I help?" she asked. He turned, his eyes widening slightly at her changed appearance. "You look better," he said awkwardly. "Thank you for the clothes," Charlotte replied, choosing to interpret his comment as a compliment. "I'd like to make myself useful." Colton nodded toward a bowl of potatoes. "Could use peeling if you're up to it." Grateful for the task, Charlotte set to work. They prepared the meal in companionable silence, moving around each other in the small kitchen with surprising ease. When they finally sat down to eat, Charlotte realized how hungry she was. The steak and potatoes were simple fare but delicious to her starved body. "You cook well," she commented after several bites. "Had to learn," he replied with a shrug. Not much call for fancy food out here, but a man can't live on beans alone. Charlotte smiled at this, and for the briefest moment she caught what might have been the hint of a smile in return. I can take over the cooking, she offered. It's the least I can do. Colton studied her across the table. This arrangement, he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. I don't want you to feel like a servant. That wasn't my intention. Then what was your intention? Charlotte pressed, returning to her earlier question. Why did you pay so much for me today? Colton set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, Charlotte thought he might evade the question again, but then he spoke. My sister Sarah, he said slowly, came west with me after the war. She was all the family I had left. 2 years ago, when she got sick, I needed help, hired a woman from town to nurse her. His expression darkened. This woman had been auctioned off to pay her husband's debts after he died. The man who bought her, he broke off, his jaw tight. He treated her worse than his livestock. Charlotte's appetite faded as she understood the implication. When I saw you on that block today, Colton continued, I saw the same fear in your eyes that I'd seen in hers. And I saw Jenkins bidding on you. His eyes met Charlotte's directly. I know what happens to women in his establishment. A chill ran down Charlotte's spine. She had sensed Jenkins' cruelty but hadn't known the specifics of his reputation. So you bought me out of charity. The word tasted bitter on her tongue. No, Colton said firmly. I bought you because no person should be owned by another. The marriage is to protect you from men like Jenkins while you're here. When you've worked off the debt, you're free to go wherever you choose. Charlotte considered his words carefully. And if I wanted to leave before then, I wouldn't stop you, he answered immediately. But a woman alone in this territory, it's dangerous. At least here you have safety and time to decide your future. The honesty in his voice convinced her more than his words. Charlotte nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me the truth. They finished their meal in silence, but it was a more comfortable quiet now that understanding had been established between them. As Charlotte cleared the dishes, Colton went to a trunk in the corner of the room and returned with a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Almost forgot, he said, placing it on the table. Got this in town today. Charlotte unwrapped the cloth to find a simple gold band. She looked up at Colton in surprise. If we're to convince people we're married, he explained, you should have a wedding ring. Charlotte slipped the ring onto her finger, finding it fit perfectly. How did you know my size? The faintest color touched his cheeks. Guessed. My mother's hands were similar to yours. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Charlotte deeply. It was unnecessary extravagance for a man who lived so simply, yet he had thought it important. Thank you, she said softly. I'll take good care of it. It's yours, he replied simply, then changed the subject. I'll be up at dawn to work with the cattle. Don't feel you need to rise early tomorrow. Rest as long as you need. Charlotte shook her head. I'll be up. There's much to learn if I'm to be useful here. A look of respect crossed his face. As you wish. Good night, Charlotte. Good night. Husband, she responded, testing the word. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes before he nodded and retreated to his bedroom. Alone in her small room that night, Charlotte lay awake, the gold band on her finger catching moonlight through the window. Her circumstances had changed so dramatically in a single day that her mind struggled to make sense of it all. Colton Wade was a puzzle stern yet kind, reserved yet considerate. He had given her safety, privacy, and respect, asking nothing inappropriate in return. As sleep finally claimed her, Charlotte wondered what the coming days would bring on this remote ranch with her paper husband. True to her word, Charlotte rose with the first light of dawn. By the time Colton emerged from his bedroom, she had coffee brewing and biscuit dough mixed. He paused in surprise at the sight of her working in the kitchen. You didn't have to get up so early. I'm an early riser, she replied, though in truth, the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside had awakened her, the distant lowing of cattle, the chorus of birds, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Coffee, he accepted the cup she offered, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Charlotte noticed how he immediately stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance between them. I'll show you around the property after breakfast, he said, so you can get your bearings. The next few hours were a whirlwind of new information as Colton led Charlotte around the ranch. He showed her the barn where they kept 4 horses, the chicken coop with a dozen laying hens, the smokehouse, and the small vegetable garden that had clearly been neglected. Sarah kept it up, he explained, looking at the overgrown plot. Haven't had much time for it since. Charlotte immediately saw an opportunity to contribute. I could restore it, she offered. I helped in my mother's garden growing up. Colton seemed pleased with this suggestion. Whatever seeds and tools you need, just let me know. We can get them on our next trip to Silver Creek. They continued to the corral where the Diaz brothers were breaking a young horse. Charlotte watched in fascination as Miguel worked with the spirited animal, his movements confident and calm. Miss Charlotte, Tomas called when he spotted them. How do you like Wade Ranch so far? It's lovely, she replied honestly. Much more peaceful than Boston, Miguel exclaimed, momentarily distracted from the horse. You're a long way from home, Senora. She is home, Colton said with unexpected firmness, placing his hand lightly on Charlotte's back. The gesture seemed both protective and possessive, a convincing touch from a new husband. The brothers exchanged meaningful glances, and Charlotte realized Colton was playing his role as devoted husband for their benefit. She leaned slightly into his touch, playing her part as well. The boss has been alone too long, Tomas said with a grin. It's good he found you. Found her in a town full of blind men, Miguel added. No man with eyes would let such a beauty get away. Charlotte felt her cheeks warm at the compliment, but what surprised her more was the genuine smile that appeared on Colton's face, the first full smile she had seen from him. For once, Miguel, we agree on something, Colton said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed unfamiliar to him. For a moment, with his hand on her back and that smile transforming his usually serious features, Charlotte could almost believe they were truly newlyweds. The thought sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. As they walked back toward the house, Colton kept a proper distance between them again. The brothers are good men, he said, but they enjoy teasing. Don't let them bother you. They seem kind, Charlotte observed. How long have they worked for you? 6 years. Their family ranch was taken by men who forged deeds during the war. His expression hardened. Too much of that happened while good men were fighting. Charlotte heard the undercurrent of anger in his voice. You have a strong sense of justice. Colton glanced at her, seeming surprised by her observation. Just believe in fair treatment, he said simply. Out here, a man's word and actions are all that matter. As they approached the house, Charlotte noticed a wagon in the distance, approaching along the main trail. Colton followed her gaze and frowned slightly. Wasn't expecting visitors, he muttered. As the wagon drew closer, Charlotte could make out a woman driving it, accompanied by a young girl of perhaps 10 or 11. Mrs. Palmer, Colton identified the visitor. Owns the next ranch over with her husband. That's their daughter, Emma. Charlotte unconsciously smoothed her borrowed dress, suddenly aware of her appearance. Should I prepare refreshments? Colton shook his head. Not necessary, she rarely stays long. As the wagon pulled up, the woman scrutinized Charlotte with open curiosity. She was perhaps 40, with a weathered face that suggested years of hard work under the western sun. Colton Wade, she called as she set the brake. Heard in town you'd taken a wife. Had to see for myself if the rumors were true. Charlotte felt Colton tense beside her, but his voice remained cordial. Mrs. Palmer, this is Charlotte, my wife. Charlotte, Martha Palmer, and her daughter Emma. Martha climbed down from the wagon, her eyes never leaving Charlotte. My. Married just yesterday, from what I hear. Quite sudden, wasn't it? Before Colton could respond, Charlotte stepped forward with a warm smile. When you know your heart, Mrs. Palmer, why wait? Colton has spoken highly of you and your husband. The lie came easily, and Charlotte saw Colton's surprised glance from the corner of her eye. Martha seemed momentarily taken aback by Charlotte's poise. Well, Martha recovered, we're neighbors after all. John and I have invited Colton for supper many times, but he's always been too busy. Her gaze swept over Charlotte's simple dress. You must join us soon. I'm sure you could use some female company out here. That would be lovely, Charlotte replied, feeling Colton's hand come to rest at the small of her back, another silent reinforcement of their supposed relationship. How did you two meet? Emma piped up, her young face alight with romantic curiosity. Charlotte felt a momentary panic at the direct question, but Colton answered smoothly. Charlotte was visiting from Boston, staying with family friends in Redemption Creek. We met at the general store. His hand pressed gently against Charlotte's back. Knew right away she was special. The simple story was perfect, close enough to truth to be remembered easily, vague enough to avoid specifics that might trip them up. "Boston," Martha exclaimed. "My, that's quite a change." "Whatever brought you all the way out here?" "A desire for adventure," Charlotte replied, drawing on her limited knowledge of penny novels about the West. "The stories of wide open spaces and new beginnings, they called to me." Martha studied her skeptically. "Well, you certainly found both." "Life out here isn't easy, especially for a woman used to city comforts." "I'm stronger than I look," Charlotte assured her with more confidence than she felt. Martha seemed ready to ask more questions, but Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Ma, we need to get to Silver Creek before the store closes." Yes, yes," Martha sighed. "Well, we must be on our way, but you must come for dinner soon. This Saturday, perhaps?" Colton and Charlotte exchanged glances. "We'd be honored," Charlotte answered before Colton could make an excuse. After Martha and Emma departed, Colton turned to Charlotte with raised eyebrows. "That was quick thinking." "I grew up watching my father charm customers," Charlotte explained. "I learned how to make people feel special while revealing very little about myself." "A useful skill," he acknowledged. "But dinner with the Palmers, Martha will have 100 questions." "Then we should prepare our answers," Charlotte suggested pragmatically. "We need a convincing story if we're to maintain this charade." Colton nodded slowly. "You're right, let's get our story straight." Over lunch, they constructed the fiction of their whirlwind courtship, how Boston-born Charlotte had come west to visit distant relatives, met the serious rancher Colton Wade, and fallen in love despite their differences. They created a timeline, memorized details about each other's pasts, largely drawn from truth to avoid confusion, and practiced speaking as though they had known each other for months rather than a day. "Your father owned a dry goods store in Boston," Colton recited. "Your mother died of pneumonia when you were 16. You have no siblings. You came west 3 months ago to stay with your mother's cousin in Redemption Creek. And you were born in Pennsylvania," Charlotte continued. "Joined the Union Army at 19. Came west with your sister Sarah after the war ended. Built this ranch from nothing over 8 years." Colton nodded, satisfied with their progress. "Should convince most folks." "What about Jenkins?" Charlotte asked, the name causing a chill to run through her. "He saw you buy me." Colton's expression darkened. "Jenkins won't be a problem. His reputation is such that no one would believe him over me, even if he did talk." He paused, studying her face. "But we should avoid Redemption Creek for a while, just to be safe." Charlotte nodded, grateful for his caution. The thought of encountering Jenkins again filled her with dread. As the day progressed into evening, Charlotte found herself studying Colton more closely. There was a rhythm to his movements, an efficiency that spoke of years of self-reliance. He never wasted a motion or a word. Yet beneath his serious demeanor, she occasionally glimpsed something softer in the way he spoke to his horses, in his patience explaining ranch operations, in the respectful space he always maintained between them. That night, after another simple but satisfying meal they had prepared together, Colton brought out a checkerboard. "Sarah and I used to play in the evenings," he explained, setting up the pieces. "Thought you might enjoy a game before bed." Charlotte was touched by the gesture. "I'd like that very much." They played in companionable silence for a while, each studying the board with concentration. Charlotte found herself relaxing for the first time since her arrival, the familiar game providing a sense of normalcy. "You're good," Colton commented after she captured 3 of his pieces in a strategic move. "My father taught me," she replied. "We played often during quiet times at the store." Colton nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me more about your life in Boston." The request surprised her. "Why?" "If we're to convince people we're married, I should know these things about you," he reasoned, though something in his expression suggested genuine curiosity. So Charlotte shared stories of her childhood in Boston, the busy streets, the changing seasons, the small apartment above her father's store where she had grown up. She described helping customers, learning to keep accounts, and the books she had loved to read during quiet moments. "And what brought you west?" Colton asked the question they both knew the answer to. Charlotte's mood sobered. After my father died, his creditors claimed everything. A man named Hargrove said my father owed him $500 from gambling debts. Her hands clenched in her lap. He took the store, our home, everything of value, but it wasn't enough. So he sold you to pay the rest, Colton finished quietly. Charlotte nodded, fighting back the sting of tears. I had nowhere to go, no family to turn to. Before I knew what was happening, I was on a train heading west with papers marking me as property to be sold at auction. Colton's expression was unreadable, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped his knee. Men like Hargrove deserve more justice than the law provides. The controlled fury in his voice was somehow comforting. Charlotte reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. Thank you for what you did today. I know it cost you more than just money. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, something passed between them, a connection deeper than their circumstances should have allowed. It was the right thing to do, he said simply, then returned his attention to the checkerboard. Your move. The next few days established a rhythm to life at Wade Ranch. Charlotte rose early each morning to prepare breakfast before Colton headed out to work. She spent her days learning the household, cleaning, organizing, planning meals from the supplies in the root cellar and smokehouse. In the afternoons, she began clearing the overgrown garden, finding satisfaction in the physical labor and the tangible results of her efforts. Colton worked from sunrise to sunset with the cattle and horses, often returning tired and dusty. Yet he always took time to ask about Charlotte's day, to explain something about ranch operations she had wondered about, or to share a quiet meal. By their fourth evening together, they had settled into a comfortable routine that belied the strangeness of their situation. After supper, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple. Sometimes they played checkers or cards. Other times, they simply sat in companionable silence. I've been thinking, Charlotte said during one such evening, about going to Silver Creek tomorrow. We need flour and sugar, and I'd like to get some seed for the garden. Colton considered this. I can take you. Been meaning to check on a new bull Joseph Green is selling anyway. I could go alone, Charlotte suggested. You're busy with the south pasture fencing. His expression turned serious. Not a good idea for you to go alone just yet. People will have questions for the new Mrs. Wade. Charlotte nodded, understanding his concern. Their fabricated marriage was still new and untested beyond the Diaz brothers and Mrs. Palmer. Besides, Colton added with the ghost of a smile, husbands and wives are supposed to be inseparable in the early days of marriage. Charlotte felt her cheeks warm at the implication. Yes, I suppose they are. The next morning, they set out for Silver Creek in Colton's wagon. Charlotte wore one of Sarah's dresses that she had carefully altered to fit her smaller frame better. She had spent extra time arranging her hair and had polished the simple gold ring that marked her as Colton's wife. You look nice, Colton commented as he helped her into the wagon, the compliment sounding unpracticed on his tongue. Thank you, Charlotte replied, surprised and pleased. I want to make a good impression. The journey to Silver Creek took just over an hour. As they approached the small settlement, Charlotte felt a flutter of nervousness. This would be their first real test as a married couple. Silver Creek proved to be larger than Charlotte had expected, though still modest by Eastern standards. A wide main street was lined with a general store, saloon, church, doctor's office, and several other businesses. People moved about their business, many stopping to stare as Colton's wagon rolled into town. News travels fast, Colton muttered, acknowledging the curious looks with stoic nods. He helped Charlotte down from the wagon with careful hands at her waist, then offered his arm as they walked toward the general store. Charlotte took it, conscious of the many eyes upon them. Inside the store, an older man with spectacles looked up from arranging merchandise. His face broke into a wide smile at the sight of Colton. Wade, heard you'd gone and gotten yourself a wife. He came around the counter, extending his hand. About time, son, Mr. Harris, Colton nodded, shaking the man's hand. This is Charlotte, my wife. Charlotte Amos Harris owns the finest store in 3 counties. You flatter an old man, Harris chuckled, turning his attention to Charlotte. Welcome to Silver Creek, Mrs. Wade. You've certainly caused quite a stir. No one even knew Colton was courting. It was a whirlwind romance, Charlotte replied with the story they had practiced. When you know your heart, why wait? Harris seemed delighted with this romantic notion. Well, you've certainly brought a smile to this community. Colton here has been nothing but work and more work since he arrived. Still am, Colton interjected, his tone light but pointed. We need supplies, Amos. As they moved through the store selecting items, Charlotte became aware of other customers entering, women whose curiosity was poorly disguised behind shopping pretenses. Soon she found herself surrounded by the wives of neighboring ranchers and townsfolk, all eager to meet Colton Wade's mysterious bride. Boston, you say? One woman asked. However will you adjust to life out here? What does your family think of you marrying so far from home? Questioned another. How did you meet our serious Mr. Wade? A third wondered with barely concealed skepticism. Charlotte answered each question with the practiced story she and Colton had developed, maintaining a warm smile despite the thinly veiled interrogation. From across the store, she caught Colton watching her, concern evident in his expression. Ladies, I believe my husband is ready to continue our errands, Charlotte finally said, extricating herself from the group. It's been a pleasure meeting you all. She moved to Colton's side, and he immediately placed a protective hand at the small of her back. The gesture seemed to convince several of the more doubtful observers, who exchanged knowing glances. You handled that well, Colton murmured as they completed their purchases. I feel like I've been examined for purchase, Charlotte whispered back, his hand pressed slightly more firmly against her back. You're not for sale, not anymore. The simple statement carried such conviction that Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude toward this complex man who had become her protector. Their next stop was the livery stable, where Colton inquired about Joseph Green's bull. As they walked, Charlotte noticed a group of men outside the saloon watching them with interest. One detached himself from the group and approached a tall, lean man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. Colton, the man greeted, tipping his hat. Heard you got yourself hitched. Sheriff Davis, Colton nodded. My wife Charlotte, Sheriff William Davis. The sheriff studied Charlotte with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Madam, quite a surprise to everyone. Colton's not known for socializing, Charlotte smiled, slipping her arm through Colton's. Sometimes the right person makes all the difference. Davis's gaze flickered to their linked arms, then back to Charlotte's face. Indeed. Whereabouts in Boston did you say you were from? The specific question, one they hadn't prepared for, caught Charlotte off guard. She felt Colton tense beside her. Beacon Hill, originally, she improvised, drawing on her knowledge of Boston's geography. Though after my father's business failed, we moved to a smaller home near the harbor. Davis nodded slowly. Long way from the harbor to Colorado territory. As I said, Charlotte replied evenly, sometimes the right person makes all the difference. Something in the sheriff's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't press further. Well, congratulations to you both. Colton's a good man. One of the few I'd trust with my life out here. Thank you, Sheriff, Colton said, clearly ready to end the conversation. If you'll excuse us, we have more errands to complete. As they walked away, Charlotte could feel the sheriff's eyes following them. He suspects something, she whispered. Davis is observant, Colton acknowledged, but he's also fair. As long as we give him no reason to dig deeper, he'll leave us be. They completed their remaining business in town quickly. By the time they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Charlotte was exhausted from the constant vigilance required to maintain their charade. As they left Silver Creek behind, she sighed with relief. That was more difficult than I expected. Colton glanced at her. You did well. They seemed to accept you. The women were curious but friendly. The sheriff, though, she trailed off, still troubled by his probing questions. Davis and I have history, Colton explained. We fought together during the war. He knows me better than most, which makes him harder to fool. Charlotte considered this new information. You trust him? With my life, Colton confirmed. But that doesn't mean I want him questioning our arrangement. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail, and in the distance, thunderheads were building over the mountains. "Storm coming," Colton observed, urging the horses to a faster pace. "We should get home before it hits." Charlotte looked at the darkening sky with concern. "Will we make it?" "Should," he replied, though his expression was doubtful. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the ranch when the first heavy drops began to fall. Within minutes, the rain increased to a downpour, and lightning flashed across the sky. "Hold on," Colton instructed, wrapping an arm around Charlotte to steady her as the wagon bounced over the increasingly muddy trail. The protective embrace was necessary yet intimate, and Charlotte found herself acutely aware of his strength and warmth beside her. Rain soaked through her dress and hair, plastering both to her skin. She could feel Colton's heartbeat where she pressed against his side, steady and strong despite the chaos around them. A particularly loud crack of thunder spooked the horses, causing them to lurch forward. Charlotte gasped, clinging to Colton as the wagon tilted precariously on the slick trail. "Easy," he called to the horses, his voice calm despite the danger. His arm tightened around Charlotte, anchoring her against him. "I've got you," he assured her, the words meant for her alone.